This one?
Yeah, copy that one and paste that one.
I want to quit.
You're live.
All right.
Start over. Prosperity.
Once upon a time, I wrote JavaScript this way. It was fine until I had to do a lot of it, and then it got messy. And then more and more JavaScript got added. The end. There we go. Maybe not quite as good as the original delivery, but. And so, a couple problems is binding just a lot of JavaScript on the page, getting really messy, really hard to maintain, hard to manage, and it's hard to reuse the code. Basically, anytime we did a new modal, it was like, oh, here's a new modal and everything. And what it actually reminded me a lot of is the old school PHP back, and Devin might be offended by this statement, but no, but it's, okay. Where you'd have these PHP files over the place and you would include stuff and you'd echo and then you do some queries in the middle of it and it just felt like very just kind of, because back then when you first started doing PHP, it was like, well, I had a website and I wanted to add like, you're logged in as so-and-so up here, and I want to add these little features, but then eventually got to a point where it's like, no, I'm building an application. I should need to treat it like an application. And so that's what we decided. That's kind of what direction went with PHP. I think the same thing's happening with JavaScript, where you go in and it used to be, you used to have little hover events and different weird things you used to do, but now it's such a core part of the application. It's like, let's treat it like it's an application and not just a bunch of scripts that run on a page. And so today, what I'm basically going to do is more of an introduction to Node. And the reason behind that is that Node helped drive a little bit kind of this more modernization of JavaScript. And then once you can write kind of modular code for Node, then tools like Webpack and Browserify and things that we'll cover next lesson will take that code and be able to run it also on the browser. And so the other part is we're going to kind of take this from the PHP perspective. Because when I first started doing JavaScript, and Node in particular, my brain would be racked over certain things because it's just different in doing it in JavaScript and Node. And what some of those differences are, and then the implications of how that's kind of shaped the way that you write JavaScript. So the very, very first thing to dive into is CommonJS and required. And so I'm not going to get into all the hairy details of CommonJS versus AMD versus, and then supporting UMD and all this other stuff. Basically, CommonJS is a way of being able to include multiple files and be able to use multiple files and reuse code in your code. And so in PHP, we have autoloaders. And that's kind of been the standard. In fact, we used to do it the old way, and we moved to autoloaders. And basically, you do one require once, and then let your autoloading take care of everything else. And this was kind of the modern way of doing PHP. We rely on the autoloader to map classes and to include those files if they haven't been loaded already. We almost never just do includes and requires on our own. We have namespaces. You can't redeclare name or redeclare the class name in PHP. It's kind of weird to say this, but PHP's kind of has this very strong structure. And then compared to Node, there is no autoloader. There are no namespaces. There are no class names. It's just all basically passing around data and objects. So we have this example here. So I have a helper.js file and I have a test.js file. And so what I'm doing here is I create a variable called helper. I'm creating an object. I give that object a variable called test, and I pass in this function. And I say, hey, console.log hello world. And then the key part is this module exports. And I say I'm going to export this helper by saying exports equals helper. And then I go in and say, okay, in my test.js file, I'm assuming they're in the same directory. I'm going to require that file. You don't need to pass in the extension. They'll do that for you. And so I say, hey, require helper, assign to this object.
I call helper object.test, and it outputs hello world. And I run that by typing node space test.js. It's really simple, but this is fundamentally actually very different than the way you would do it in PHP. And so I have some demo code. Then if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to chime in. This goes, okay. Is that better? So here I have, man, why is it not showing what file I have selected over here? This theme's annoying. Okay. So I have my helper.js, and I went and I declared, once again, my object, gave it a test. I said console log. This is just a syntax that I use because you do a lot of console logging and then trying to find later on where that log came from. I always specify either like the file name or the class name or something, and then the method, and then whatever text I want. And so when this code will run, it'll go var helper. It'll create this object. I'll then log out to the console, helper.js executed, and then I export this object via doing the module exports equals this object. Then on my test side, I'm actually going to go in and require this twice. I'm going to go require this to helper 1, require this to helper 2, run test on helper 1, run test on helper 2, and at the end I'm going to go console log done. And so this is going to have to be much bigger too. There's no way you can see that. And also, Chick-fil-A came in the middle of a, oh, it's so ugly, but we'll do that. Okay. Make this slightly smaller. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna type node test.js. So when that runs, it goes in and says, okay, helper.js executed. So it comes down, requires this for the first time, and builds the object. That console log gets called, but then when I require it a second time, it's not going to run that. It's going to remember or cache basically what this file exported, and we'll run that again, which is a little different than PHP, which is good to keep it straight. Because a lot of times when you're requiring files, you don't want to be executing a lot of logic outside of what you export, because it'll only get ran once, unless you want that desired functionality. And then console, I get that. So that's the way require works with local files. Another thing that threw me when I first started JavaScript is this idea of passing like kind of relative paths, like where my file is. Like PHP, normally I'd go and pass either absolute paths or rely on my autoloader. Now, if I want to go in and be able to use other modules, I think we're going to cover it more in depth later on. But there's a tool called NPM. It's Node Package Manager, I believe is what it stands for. And I can go in and install Lodash. Lodash is basically all the stuff that you thought JavaScript would have but doesn't have until ES6 came out. But it's kind of a helper function to do simple things like iterating over an array and stuff like that. And so now I've installed Lodash. And if I look, I have this node modules directory. And so what will happen is that when I require something, it will go back and look for this node modules, and then if I have any direct, look back and like require this directory, and technically it'll go back and look back for other node modules directories, and if it finds one, it'll look inside and try and find, see if there's a Lodash folder. It'll come in here, and then it will look for, I believe it's the index.js, and it'll run index.js and get its effect.
It actually looks for package.json.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can change that to what it was. I think the default's the index.js. So it'll look, you know, in the package.json and look for the main. And it says, oh, that's index.js. It's kind of the default, kind of the standard. And then we'll go in and run index.js, which you can see has all its awesome functionality. You wouldn't want to go and try and understand this very quickly, but probably at the very, very end, it'll go and export. It'll export itself. And so that's how I could go in here, and I could do something. Go create an array. Oops. I can go pass in helper 1 and helper 2. And if I wanted to go use Lodash, typically it's a replacement for underscore, which is a one. So most of you'll see people use the underscore character equals require. And here I don't go in and say node modules or anything. I just say I want Lodash, and Node will go out and figure out where that's at and load that for you. Load it once and then keep that there. And then I could go over technically and do for each. Pass it in my array, and then a callback, which it'll have the parameter of the item. And then I can do item dot test. And go and type no tests, and I get the same thing. It goes out and finds Lodash, returns that. It'll go out and find the different helpers, and even though I've called require twice, it'll only require it once. If I had lots of different files and required it, once again, if referencing that particular file on the file system, it'll only execute that code once. And then I go through and I say, hey, this helper library has a for each function, pass it in the array, and then the callback to get the items, call that, and then call done. Are there any questions so far on this? Yes?
So the underscore stuff, is that when you're only requiring one external library? What happens if you
Yeah, so if you want to go, so what you do is, what's another helpful library?
underscore is just the name of it.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
very nice.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the, yeah.
I'm assuming you wouldn't do multiple.
You probably wouldn't, but it wouldn't, maybe for clarity's sake. But technically, you theoretically could. So if it's down here later, it wouldn't be, I wouldn't recommend it, but you technically could do like var Lodash equals require. And I'll just go grab that object that it cached and return it there. But that's kind of one of the weird, it's one of the different things. And in some ways, it's really not like underscore things. I can go Lodash. And I can go over here and say Lodash. So I'm never locked into anyone's particular naming convention. Now, for clarity's sake, I would probably want to follow the conventions as close as possible. That way, if I have like a 300-line file, I'm down there like, well, what's this? So I called this like awesome, and down later down the file, like, well, what's this? That's just kind of nice to try and follow the conventions. But let's go ahead. We'll go in and require a promise. And as you see, I'm calling it promise. I'm going to install a promise library called Bluebird. and I go and reference it to that package name. So I go Bluebird. It's the package name. I will go out there. It'll go out there, load the module, execute it, and return it. And I can call this whatever I want. If for whatever reason I had two different promise libraries, I could be like, this is Bluebird. Which this is somewhat similar to, you know, if I was to go in and say the use syntax. I mean, it works in the hood very differently, but it's trying to accomplish the idea of PHP if I use the use syntax. Go use this, bring in this really long class name, and call it this short name instead.
So one reason also that you would want to name Bluebird promise like that versus naming it Bluebird or whatever else is because it's completely compatible with the actual standardized ES6 promise library. So at some point in the future, you could break out that requirement.
Yep. Or if, let's say that someone comes out with Bluebird, you know, Redbird, that's even better, and it's the same API interface, I could go and require that whole new thing, and my application will just go ahead and use that. And so that's the fundamentals of kind of using require, to go in and require files. For your application code that's in your repository that you haven't installed it through node modules, through NPM, you'll always use local references. And then for the stuff that are modules that you've done, you can go ahead and just require the module name. And then sometimes I can React, what's it called? React add-ons? Is it with add-ons? If you want to go get the extra super duper one, is that this will go in, look in the React module, and then in a subfolder for add-ons, whatever, I can't remember the exact name, and go grab that instead. But 99% of the time, you won't need to do that. But if you ever see code examples of that syntax, that's what's happening. Is they're going in and traversing into the package itself, the files inside of it. So that seems super, super simple. If you want to underherd how require.js works, I have this. There's this article that goes through and it actually goes to the code of what the require module does for Node.js. It's a really interesting read. But this has some implications of this paradigm. The first one is in PHP we have Composer and we have libraries. You might use like Swift for sending mail. You might use Monologue. But in comparison to JavaScript, like they're pretty chunky. They're pretty large-sized modules. Because you don't have to worry. Because Node is basically built around this concept of just exporting either an object or a function or whatever it may be. In JavaScript, it's more like not the Duplo Legos, but like the real Legos, and you'll use way more pieces. You know, if I look at some of my PHP code, I'm like, oh, I might go include one or two other libraries. If I look at my my Node code, especially like the Node code that I use to start my server or whatever, I probably use 20 different packages. That's really powerful because it gives you a ton of flexibility in moving pieces. Where I could get frustrated when you're first starting to learn is when you're like, okay, I have these 10 pieces. One of them's not working. Which one's not working? And that can be sometimes the interesting part of like when you first start learning to piece them together. The other problem that I found, or just challenge that I found, is typically when you look at code that people have written online for examples, there will be an underlying assumption that, oh, if I use this .map, I'm assuming you've made this ES6 compatible, or I'm assuming you've loaded in some type of mapping function or whatever it is. So sometimes you'll run the code that they give you and it won't work, and there's like this as given assumption that, oh, you kind of know how to make this work already. So as you're first starting to learn, that can be really frustrating. Fortunately, I have good coworkers who say, hey, this isn't working. Why is it not working? And they can say, oh, well, there's this. They're assuming that you have this, you know. For me, it was Gulp. Gulp has a Gulp map module that I wasn't using, and none of my Gulp stuff was working. And every example out there would use it, and no one in the top would just put, you know, Gulp map equals require Gulp map. And so that would get kind of confusing. But after you kind of get around it, I've been really enjoying just how small and simple these pieces are and how easy it is to be able to pull something in. So with NPM, that's the tool that you use to, and we'll cover more in depth with, who's giving the next presentation? Is it Nate or you? Okay. Russell will probably cover a lot more in depth. You can do things where you can have with PHP, we have the composer.json file. There's a package.json file. I'll let Russell cover maintaining your dependencies and all that stuff in that presentation. But for the time being, you can just go in and say, hey, npm install, and then whatever package name. You know, certainly I could go, I wrote one called Trogdor, and I'll go out there and go out, fetch all of its dependencies. It's actually probably was this bad example because I think it has a lot of dependencies. Yeah, it does. And go out and install them and put them all underneath my Node modules folder for me so I can access them. Another interesting aspect of Node, because the way that you acquire dependencies, so my Trogdor, so they go in and they're install minimist, async, Q, apparently I was using Q, Lodash, React Router, Liftoff, all these different things, and they all have their version numbers. By default, that module will have all of its own copies of its own dependencies. And so if I have another dependency that uses a different version of Lodash, if I remember correctly, it will install its own version, and when it runs, it will include its own version. And so with Composer, we run into issues where you have to worry about because the class names are hard-coded and they're strict. You run into issues where you have conflicts. With npm and Node, it kind of installs its own. I believe there's a way to help cut down the bloat. If you want to, you can go in and say, hey, install one version of Lodash or whatever and have all the modules use it. But by default, unless you're trying to package and ship like an application or something, you know, this is kind of the Node way, which feels really weird for a PHP developer, but that's just kind of the way it is. You say, hey, you know, those modules will go in, and most modules won't have a billion dependencies because they're typically better written than the stuff I throw together. Yeah.
One note on that, actually, npm will try to optimize a little bit. If there's a key that satisfies the dependency requirement of a package that you're installing at the top level, it won't install it in the submodule.
Oh, cool. And then it would find it when it traverses down.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. That's good to know. Cool. That's why the semantic versioning is really
That
important.
also costs a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
You gotta watch out. Remove package. Or
Yeah.
a version of whatever.
Yep. Yeah. So that is that's kind of npm. So this is kind of like the Composer for Node. Once again, they're kind of similar, but there's some very fundamental differences about the way npm approaches the problem and the way Composer approaches the problem. The one thing I like about Composer is it has the lock file, where when you go to Composer update, it will go and generate saying, this is the exact number of dependencies and their versions and the URLs that I used to install it. So that way when you go and you install on in production, it won't read your Composer.json file, it'll read the lock file and just replicate all the same instructions. On NPM, I've had issues where locally it was fine. Someone did an update, my stage server breaks, and I'm like, oh, apparently they updated a version and now I have a bug. So they're kind of trade-offs. All right, so Lodash. This is probably I really like using it. There are lots of little functions that you think JavaScript would have and are planned to have in the new ES6 versions. But until then, you don't. Where's the documentation? There we go. You don't have. Classic examples like the for each. And so there are lots of these little helper functions, and they'll typically be categorized by here are things that you want to use with arrays. Here are things that you want to use with the prototype chain. And here are things you want to use with collections that could be an object or an array. Here's stuff that you can use with functions. And so one that I use a ton is like object assign, where I basically can go in and I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. But this is really helpful. So if, you know, because a lot of times you'll Google for how do you do this, and someone will give you a pure JavaScript way of doing it, and it's like 20 lines, and you're like, okay. Or it's like 4 lines that have like 5 statements in each line, and you're just like, okay. Lodash makes it really nice to be able to go in and grab, get all that nice helper functionality. So that way when you read your code, it makes more logical sense of what you're doing versus, oh, I know when I see this for with loop when a certain structure and whatever it's trying to accomplish X, Y, Z. This is another one. When I found Lodash, I think I remember hearing Justin or David or someone talk about it. I was like, where was this when I first started trying to learn this? Okay. All right. So the next topic I wanted to talk about a little bit is Express. So if you, we're not gonna dive into it too much, but if you want to serve web pages with Node, pretty much the de facto way to go is using Express, and it's basically a web server middleware that you can go in and use. And so I thought I would just give you a quick preview of that. Thanks. So we have a tool that our team uses we call Clarity. I might have demoed it here before. But basically, I'll show you too so you can have some context. I have to be on the Wi-Fi. Okay. And it's a tool that goes and allows us to go and munge data from GitHub and Pivotal Tracker, associate it together, and I can go and say, oh, I have 7 open pull teams. I can see their status. When I this node in NPM is that it was and so if I look under the hood, splash dust. And then we'll go into a little bit of in the small Lego pieces where I bring in a tool called Minimus, which is great for processing the arguments. It allows you to use like nice arguments for your processes, and I use the .end, which allows me to set a .end environment file, and it will go in and read that. And then I use like the file system, which comes from Node. I think path comes from Node. And then I have Bluebird. And so all these different aspects. And then I basically go in and I require Express right here. And then I call Express. And this Express, it basically exposes a function that you can call and create an instance of Express, which most people call app. And then I can configure that app to say, hey, you know, I want to use this logger, set the dev. I want you to be able to parse JSON body objects. And then when I want static content served from this folder, the API/API, I want you to use my API router that I have defined. And then at the very end, I say, hey, serve anything else as index.html file, which goes and basically loads up my React environment. So if you're looking to do any type of serving like an API or a web page, Express is kind of your go-to library to use for. Okay, let's try this again. Oh. Oh. Can you still hear the audio? I just want to join the Wi-Fi. It hiccuped. Any questions so far? I don't blow. Okay. Oh, present to everyone. I'm going to break the first cardinal rule of presenting and open up a chat application.
It's about a 30-second lag.
30-second lag? All right. Okay. I'll wait to hear otherwise if it's not working. Okay. Okay, so before we hop into promises, I was late throwing these slides together, so there's a couple of things I want to cover. So probably the biggest thing are the different types of patterns that you can use to export your modules. So let's make a new directory. Maybe. New folder. Okay, apparently it doesn't want me to make a folder. Okay, we'll just use this stuff again. So let's actually let's not do that. Let's do this. So let's say I have a helper. So my first option is I could technically like module exports equals 1, 3. And I can just go ahead and export a string. And or just make sure that it works. Oh, thank you. That's how I know you guys are following along. Because if you can tell, there's parts. If you're like, oh, there's going to be a parse error. Pull it up so. Okay. And then, so that's one, way of you can export basically anything. So something that I find very common, and typically what I'll do is I will at the top of my file create a variable, and whatever it is, it's a helper equals, I'll create an object. Now in PHP, in fact, let me make a PHP file. So if I went in and said helper and then test function, and then I export this object would be doing something simpler if I had something like class helper, and then I had static functions, static public function, or probably public function test, and I did like a echo hello world. That would basically be the equivalent. Because when it returns this object, it's not going to know state. Like that object's going to be the same for everyone. And so that's kind of like a singleton object. I wouldn't call it, it's not quite a singleton object, but it basically is the same object that'll be used by everyone. So it's like basically having a PHP class that just has static functions. Another option that you have is, I've heard different names for this type of methodology, but what I could do is I could go and export a function. So here's this function, and then inside of this function, I can return an object. And so if I go in here and say var, test equals 1, 2, 3, and I return something like get test function return test. Okay, and then I return this helper. So I'm returning just a function. Assume that on the consumer side is I go var, I call it helper. I have maybe an instance of that helper. I call that function. And that function will execute this variable scope. These are would be kind of like private variables for this interface. And then I return an object, which is basically the interface saying, hey, everything inside of here has access to these variables, but the outside world doesn't. And so I created a get test, and that just returns a function that returns test, which refers to this. And so if I go console log get test. Yes. You guys are following along. I'm proud. Press save. Cool. All right. So this pattern is actually a pretty common pattern. The one thing you'll notice is that you never, at least you're not using, I'm not like right here going this dot test. I'm just referring to this variable, which is scoped, to this function call. And so this is kind of a simple way of being able to pass back, be able to create an interface that has some private, and if I want to have like a public variable, I could go in there and do like test2. And if I do test2 or 6, if I call test, it's going to be undefined because it's like that doesn't, this function didn't return that in that object. Now, when we go to do React, most of the stuff that they do is not this. The reason why I show you this is lots of other JavaScript stuff will do this. So I look at the Express. So when I looked at my example over here with Express, when I went and I said, hey, I required Express, I called a function which returned an object that had all of these functions assigned to it, and call those functions. Because what I didn't do is I didn't type new. I don't know if Express supports that or not. I didn't go and create like a class, like an object using a constructor. I just used a function, which is kind of more like a factory where it just returns an object. Yeah. Yep. That's exactly right. And so you'll see this. So that's why, and that's one of the tricky things. Like with PHP, if I go, hey, here's a PHP class to use. Like, oh, I go in and I create new instances and I pass into its constructors my parameters, and that's how I use that. In JavaScript, there's way more nuance into the way that you use. And that's why whenever you go to use a library, it's really important to look at the documentation, because like I just can't assume I'll be calling new Express. Or if I go and I get React, like over here, I don't go you know, my React equals React. Because this interface is different than that. And so that's just kind of one of the, like I said, it's a two-edged sword when it comes to JavaScript. On the one hand, it's really powerful. You can do a lot of cool stuff, but you also you can get bit by it. You have to kind of be aware, like, you know, modules kind of, there's a lot of different patterns that they can follow. And so, and this is where I probably need the help with the more smarter JavaScript people. So let's say if I wanted to do more of a class constructor type of a thing, what I would is I could go in and let's see how I do it in Clarity. I just have to look it up. Yep, that's, yep. So what I would do is, so right now, helper, and just for my sanity, what I would typically do is any type of classes and things like that, I always, you know, capitalize, just kind of to signal and say, hey, so now instead of this just being a function on a call, I'm going to make this a constructor. And in this constructor, I could go in and say this test equals 1, 2, 3. And I am going to export this. Now, if I wanted to, helper.prototype, add a function called getTest, I would go like this, equals function, and I would return this dot test. And so now, what I'm going to do is my instance. So right here, I technically don't have to capitalize this. It would be just fine not capitalized. For clarity's sake, I would probably go like this. And so now I've required and it's returned a constructor. So now I have this helper constructor. And so what I would do is I'd go in and type new helper instance. The instance get test. It returns the 1, 2, 3. What's also cool is let's go in and helper prototype. We'll create an increment function. And so we set test to 1. This test plus. And so what I'll do is I'll console log and then instance increment. We'll call out 3 times. And then call that. So I started at 1, called increment 3 times, I got my 4. So this seems pretty straightforward, and you know, work is when you start introducing the callbacks inside of here and managing what this refers to. That's where it gets fun. So if I'm smart, let's see if I can come up with an example on the fly of this. So let's say on my increment, let's do this. For whatever reason, let's say I have some type of asynchronous function I want to have happen, which I'm not going to write, but what I could do is I could go in and pass in a callback. So if I go this right here, and I'll set that to 0 milliseconds. I run this. And then it didn't work. And so this, I'm not smart enough to know the technical answer to this. This is no longer, it's referring to a different execution scope from this for this function instance, not this helper instance. And so if I remember correctly, I need to go ahead and say, I need to bind to this function the instance of this, the execution scope of this guy.
Yeah, dumping it out, you need to delay when you dump it out because you can turn the set one up until after it.
All right. Okay. All right, this is perfect. We're going to segue into promises. Because this is totally the problem that you get. Now, if I went in here in this console log and I said set timeout fun second, that's true, because it would append it to the, yep, appends it. All right, okay. So before I segue into the promises, but one last thing I'd like to mention is typing this helper.prototype.increment equals function. That can kind of feel like it's kind of long. It's totally valid. One thing that I've seen lately is if I use Lodash, and there might be assign, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it, hey, I want to assign to the helper prototype this object. And then I can come in here, pass in the functions. Now, the syntax slightly changes because now I'm basically defining an object and then assigning it to this prototype object. But in theory, this is the same thing as doing this. And this is kind of my current preference for defining variables.
Is there a reason you don't just set the object you're passing to assign? Why don't you just set that?
Oh.
Well, because that extends the prototype, because that prototype actually means, like, for example, your constructor, so you have prototype.constructor, and if you just have object, you might use that.
Oh yeah. That's the smart edit. That's exactly it. I was like, there's a reason why, because I remember I think I tried doing exactly that, and I'm like, it didn't work, and so I figured this out, and that's the reason why. Because you basically reassign, you basically give it a new prototype and you lose all the existing stuff in there. So this basically goes over and says, hey, iterate through this object and assign all these keys to this value, this prototype with these values. So that's kind of the, just a little bit of the nuance with kind of the JavaScript. And you kind of get, it feels weird at first, but as you start working with it more and more, you kind of understand it. But it's really important to kind of understand that nuance to start looking at people's code, because you look at all these different modules, because there's so many you get to use and so many you have to look at, that it's kind of understanding the nuance of how they operate and the differences between that. Okay, so now we are going to go into promises. Okay, so for me, it took me quite a while to be able to wrap my head around promises. And but having them in place is really powerful, because it allows you to still be able to go in and refactor your code and go in and kind of massage things around and be able to adapt changes as you go. As you saw, if I had to introduce some asynchronous event with my increment, I basically broke everything else that happened afterwards. And I'd have to go in and change it. I think it was in JS Training, that was like a year ago, that the light went off my head. He's like, hey, if there's any possibility for asynchronous stuff, just use promises, because then asynchronous promise code can work with other asynchronous promise code. But once you switch from procedural synchronous to if you need to introduce any asynchronous step in any part of that along the way, you have to go in and refactor everything after that. And so it's better to say, hey, I'll just start with asynchronous stuff. So a promise is basically an object that says, hey, you can't use me right now technically, but I'm returning a promise that you can then listen to, or you can attach to. It says, once I have finished or failed, you can then execute code on top of that. And so if I, so let's, I'm trying to think of a good example. Let's just do this. We'll take our increment, but let's imagine that this increment is going to talk into a server, calling the increment, getting the new value, and returning that. So there's kind of an asynchronous step into that. So there's a couple different ways. If you're using code that, so let's say I had a magical library, like Magic API. I just had a Magic API that supported promises. Let's say on that Magic API, it supported promises. Says, hey, I want to increment page view, like on the classifieds, number of times something's been viewed. What that would do is that would return to me a promise. And then I could go in there and then say then, and you'd have to look at the documentation, but this Magic API should return the value of that increment. So I could be like new value. This test equals new value. And then, okay, so that's great. Now this increment function right here is still going to run synchronously. And so what I need to do is if I want people to be able to use it asynchronously, I got to return the promise. So what's happening here is as I get the Magic API object, I call a function, increment page view, that returns a promise. I then, on that promise object, I call the then function, which accepts a callback, which I say, hey, once you've promised, I don't care if you talk to one API, I don't care if you talk to a million APIs, I don't care if you take a minute, if you take an hour a day. Once you're done, let me know. Here's the callback I want you to call, and pass me the value, and then I'm going to handle whatever, and then I can return. I could set my this, except I can tell you already. I'm going to have to do the bind. And I can do the set this value, and maybe I'll probably even want to return it. That way, I can return that value. And so when I go to use, if I go, should you just create the Magic API?
Or if you want to actually get that test value back, you have to send it callback. Well, not really, because you're returning a promise.
Yeah, so this would be returning a promise, and that promise I'm assuming would.
But you have to return a promise from, well, then it's your promise, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah. So maybe this Magic API is a bad example.
But you can wrap it in another promise, you can say return a promise, and then it's all.
Yeah. And so what I'm doing on this example is I'm like, what's what I want to do? I'm not hijacking. I'm like, tagging on to the promise that the Magic API returns. Another thing I could do is I could do what Justin talked about is I could do something like return new promise. And with Bluebird, I think the API, the syntax you use is you have these two callbacks that this promise will get, and it's called resolve and reject. And then inside this function, I could do whatever things, and whenever I was done asynchronously, I could say resolve and whatever value. Or if there's an error, I could do a reject and pass in an error saying, hey, I wasn't able to connect to the internet or whatever it may be. So let's get rid of Magic API for a second because I want to be able to actually run stuff. So when I do the set timeout, we'll assume in that portion I'm doing some sort of URL request or whatever it may be. So I'm going to return a new promise. And it seems kind of weird, but typically when you're working with promises, like the first thing your function will do is return. Typically you have that statement at the end, but that technically would be no different than this. And then the two parameters that this takes is hold on a second. Why am I brain farting?
The function resolve.
That's it. So promise takes a callback, and that callback takes this function, the callback, will have two parameters, resolve and reject. And so set timeout. I call my asynchronous function. We'll wait a second, just for kicks and giggles. And so if I want to, yeah, I will. Yep. One thing you'll see. What's the recommendation on the var self stuff? I heard some people like it, some people don't.
So self will be more performant because we call bind to return the after function by using bind set up to this. So it can be
okay. So a lot of times what you'll see is people do either var self equals this, which basically says, hey, the scope, the reference to this in this context. Yeah, I can then refer to it as this dot test equals, plus. Or I could go and bind there and bind there. It's so we'll stick with the bind stuff. I'm trying to be better and use bind.
Now, could you just return the promise instead of setting it to a variable, right? If you just get rid of the
Yep. Yeah, so I could totally just do this. And this is typically what you'll actually see is like the very first line is the return. The very first thing it does basically is that this function will immediately return a promise. And the purpose behind that is just be able to go say, look, inside of here, we know it's going to take some time or whatever. We don't care. So the code that's relying on me, I'm just going to return a promise, and then they can attach to that promise object to know what to do next. So this, and then I'm also going to return. And so I'm returning an object. Now, if, no, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to call the resolve function on self.test. And we won't worry about reject yet. Okay. Yes. Okay, so now I want to go and use this promise. So I went ahead and I got my get test. That's currently synchronous. It just runs. And then I want to call this increment. Now, this is happening asynchronously. And so now what this returns, technically, is a promise. And so what I could do is I could go in and say, after I increment, I can call the then function, which basically just attaches it to the promise. Like, hey, whenever you're done, I want to do this. It'll actually receive the new value that we have. And then I have an option. I can either my options are I can do whatever, and then if I return an object or if I return anything that's not a promise, it'll then consider that done and then continue on. Or I can return a promise and say, hey, I want to attach another promise to this. So what I could do is I could go this, return, instance, increment. And then And basically what we'll do is go in and do those three things synchronously. Well, treat it serially is probably the correct term to use. And then when I'm all done, I can console log instance get test. Get rid of these. Get rid of these. Huh? So for this control, it seems a little bit more messy. But if I was to go in and put like actual like asynchronous calls and using callbacks, their callbacks quickly, extremely quickly would you start writing code like way over here. Because you have all these nested things. And then if you want to change the order of when you increment or do whatever, like you're changing indentation and make sure you grab it right. Whereas promises, you can still treat it serially if you want. Let's see if this works. So it's going to wait. Yes. So I'm going to change this timeout to like 200 so it goes a little faster. And what I'll also do is I'm going to console log. All this. All right. So that's the way that you can go in and with promises. I called it 4. So if I wanted to do like the old one, I'd just get rid of one of these. So basically, I'm going in, and the way the JavaScript will read this file is it will go basically and say, oh, I'm going to increment, and then I'm going to define all the steps that happen next, but I'm not going to execute any of it yet. I'm going to wait until these functions finish up, and then I'm going to call these callbacks and pass in the value that's returned by that promise. Are there any questions so far on this?
The thing I'm wondering is, what happens if the promise resolves before you attach it?
Well, your then should happen synchronously. You should always attach a then synchronously to the promise.
So part of the A+ promise spec states that even if it calls resolve immediately, it can't actually resolve it on those callbacks. It's essentially like doing the set time out here. It defers it till it queues it up in the empty, so it's going to have to come after the call cycle finishes. So it will never resolve before it.
Yeah.
But if you do find something after it's already resolved, then it calls it.
Now,
Right, because it knows it already resolved, so I can handle that right now.
so yes.
I'm just wondering if
So you can it should stop if you do the traditional then. Some of the libraries have well, so yeah, so the change should stop. And then at the end, what I should do, if I was good, is do a catch. Which is actually really important because a lot of times, if I don't do that and something throws an exception or whatever, it'll get swallowed, and I won't be able to see that typically. Yep, we'll follow with that catch. Correct.
Except if you pass a reject handler, you can pass an individual reject handler as a second argument to that.
Yeah.
Then that'll have a specific promise rejection.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that's kind of a catch-all. I don't know which one failed.
Yep, that's correct.
you show that in the,
Yeah, so I will.
like, if it's greater than 2, then it rejects.
Yeah. So if this dot test is greater than 2,
Well, it's a very small.
memory is important to us. We don't want to use up a whole lot of stuff, even though that statement is actually very false. I put everything. So I put this inside of there, and then I reject. And then do I pat? I call it reject.
That's a message.
I pass a message.
Find out.
We'll find out.
When rejecting the handle, there's space here between error object and pass that around to the stack.
Does it take? So do that would be like new.
Yeah, this new error and pass message. It's common practice in JavaScript.
Cool.
Like passing error object, that's how they get stack trace.
Yeah, because that's the thing that stinks if you don't do it. If you don't follow some of those best practices, your stack traces get gobbled up, and you're like, well, where the heck did this fail?
So, yeah, the way you've written it, it looks like that you could pull, reject
Because every default trace will be assigned to the connection to state one to resolve rejected. I'll resolve that and reject.
Yeah. Okay. All right. But yeah, you totally could. If I wouldn't have done that, like technically, reject could have, and resolve could have been called. And I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it'll just ignore this resolve. It like, oh, I've wrote this. The state of this promise has been rejected. And probably vice versa. If you resolve it and then you try to reject it later, is
There's actually something called the promise stack. It defines all this and every promise library calls it.
yep. So that's it failing. Do you have?
going back to kind of on the cleanliness part of it.
You failed.
So you can get rid of the anonymous function there and just put in the name of the function because it already knows what the variable is.
So-
just delete that whole thing and then just put increment.
Yeah. So I don't know. So he's talking about you could do like inst. And what I'm doing is I'm not.
It'll call it immediately.
No. So if I don't.
It'll still call it. And
Yeah,
pass the
this.
value in, like the handler.
What I don't know is I have to bind instance to it.
For increment, yes, because it needs to this context. So
It needs to this
if you do that,
context.
you would have to bind it, yes.
Yeah. But that would be another option. Let's see if it works. Let's see if it fails it. Yep. It totally worked.
If you
Actually,
bind it,
Let's try.
Yeah, what's the bind? What the bind?
So the bind references to whatever it's calling it. And I'm the wrong person to ask about this because I'm going to use the.
Yeah, I talked about this last week. What it does is the first parameter you pass in, it's like call or apply. Yeah, it's like that. The first parameter you pass in, it creates a wrapper function that's always going to guarantee that's your context, and then anything else you pass in after that, it'll bind with arguments essentially and pass it through. You can look that up on docs, but same concept as call and apply, but it creates a wrapper function that passes that in.
So the difference between bind and call and apply. Call and apply you use
They're just
at call
function.
times.
Yeah,
That's going to be you define for call.
creates a function.
You don't want to see this? Yeah, so here, so you can see this, it gave an error, it's like not a number when I remove the bind. Because what's calling that function is now the promise, not the helper. And so I have to, because I have to go, okay, I have to bind whatever's going to be, what?
Clear, this should reference the
Yeah. That's why the bind is needed. So sometimes, so yeah, so I could go in there and then just do a bunch of these.
But if things actually pick up parameter, you know, you just
Yep.
that, then it would screw it up.
And then you would need it, and then you would still need to do this. And then also how to make, yeah. So that's one way you could do it. If you saw that, that's what they were doing is more succinct.
How would the promises work with recursion?
So you can do recursion. Like you could do recursion. So the thing that you have to just be careful of is your function should return a promise, and if you say almost wonder if I should draw this on the whiteboard. Okay. Call me Clark Gilbert. All right. So I have my function, and it returns promise. That's an awesome square.
For those on the hangout, he's written the word function.
Oh, sorry, guys.
And then a box.
We love you guys remotely. So it returns a promise. So I go on and I attach it then to this. Now, when inside that function, I could technically, on this promise, attach other thens to it inside. Does that make sense?
So the promise function will be executed immediately before even that then binding. Yeah. When you define the promise, the function side will.
And so the function comes in, and so inside the function is returning the promise. Like you could go in and because you should have a resolve and reject, so you can do all sorts of stuff on the inside of there. And there's been times where I probably couldn't show you, where I go in and I attach to the promise. And so on the outside it doesn't resolve, but I'm attaching that same promise on the inside. Okay. If we're ready to see something crazy.
Yes.
Okay. So here's a little bit of React code. You can see really here, just for best. So here's a kind of all of the classes I'm using. Here are all of like the internally written stuff. You can tell that's because I've referencing them locally and not through the node module stuff. And then in this one, this is a big no-no, but I'm using something called React Async, but it worked really well for what I was doing. And I only used it at what I call my top-level controller. I'm not even going to get into that. We'll let Ryan set it straight. But basically what happens is that I have this build required state. And when I load this page, so if I refresh, you can see even better because we're developers. We'll only show XHR requests. So you can see I'm making all these API requests and I'm waiting for them to kind of all the important stuff to finish before I render the page. And so in here on build required state, I go in and I say, okay, my team store, I need you to go get some information. And once that's finished, go ahead and update the progress, set this team to my state, and then I need to do another asynchronous thing. Go get all the projects for this. I go get the current project name that I'm looking at. So that goes and say, okay, now update the progress again. I have a function that basically goes up in increments that by 15%. And then I set the project to my state. Then I need to go out and I need to get the releases. I need to get the pull requests for a given repository. Now, those can happen in parallel. So what I do is I go in and I create these promises, and it's an array, and I call this, and each one of these returns a promise when they're done. And so then this part right here returns promise.all. And what that instruction says, hey, I'm basically wrapping these three promises, which are running in parallel, and they'll return at different times, whatever. Once they're all done, then I want to go and I have a function called build state get branches, and I pass in the state. Yeah, and that also returns a promise. So that promise, when all those get done, will also return a promise. When all of that's done, I got my branches. So I go and I set this branches to my state, go through there. I call it, this is a synchronous function that goes and parses a bunch of information and pulls it out. And then say, oh, I need to get the state for my master, pull that in, and do all of that. And so that is a lot of stuff. Now, I've probably reorganized the execution order of this a lot of different times, and it's not as easy as just synchronous code. Like synchronous code, I just do it one line at a time. But the first version of this project we wrote was in PHP, and it took like a minute to render a page because I had to go make. I mean, how many API requests did this sucker make? 44 API requests, and so it did those synchronously. And so it took a long time to load. Whereas this one ran them all. I did them all in 2 seconds. Because they all happened almost all in parallel. And I've kind of shifted things around. I have a portion, so as you can see, it'll go and load, and then like the story details. I say, you know what, render the page and we can load that afterwards. And I have this build additional state. And I go through and I say, hey, go get the requests, go grab the releases for those pull requests things, and go grab a bunch of other stuff. And then in here, I can go in and say, hey, it's like this build state get repositories. I'm going to have a bunch. I could have changed this to a map if I was not a noob. But I go and I basically build a bunch of promises, and I return a promise like, hey, once all of these promises on the inside are done, you can then execute. And so it takes a while to kind of get used to, but this is actually, once you kind of know what you're looking at, it's pretty easy to look at and maintain and manage. And this is kind of the first time when I was like, okay, I think I finally kind of know what I'm doing with promises. And so that's kind of the power and the purpose of promises. And then probably the last thing is that if you have a function that could even possibly maybe have some asynchronous code involved in the future, because I mentioned before, as soon as you need to move synchronous code to async, you have to refactor everything after that, because you have to turn all of that to async as well. It's kind of nice just to start async. And so if I come over here, I could return, so let's say I have a magical system. I go, oh, I'm an idiot. I don't need to set timeout. That's really dumb. What am I doing? I could go in there and return. I think this is the correct way to do it. The promise object has, is that right? Resolved. And this, yes, plus. I realized we're doing code review, and Matt's like, Justin, you're dumb. Why are you doing that? You can just do this. Huh?
I promise I didn't.
I can go in and say, hey, in the future, I might talk to a Redis database. In the future, whatever, I'm going to go ahead and return a promise. So this happens. This is all synchronous code. There's no asynchronous stuff happening, but I can still treat it as a promise. And if I save this, hopefully that still works. Does it resolve? I can't remember. Yeah, well, it's still the event loop stuff and whatever. But you're able to go in and it's something that's still synchronous. Why is that? Oh, I'm not. I got lost. I lost my file then. That's the function. And what was it? Inst. And I'm 6. So technically, I have the IO, the event loop, or well, let me say, I haven't made any IO operations that are asynchronous or whatever. But in the future, so technically, this has all happened without any type of real asynchronous pausing happen. But my code can still treat this asynchronously. I have to return a promise, and then down the road, if I need to refactor this and have it talk to Redis or whatever, that's not going to be a huge, big deal.
I kind of got to, like, as I've been working on learning this, was that I was doing some synchronous stuff, and then I was going to go out to a Redis database. I couldn't figure out, like, how to kind of make those work together, right? Because I started with some synchronous functions. And then in the middle there, I'm like returning promises. And then, you know, I kind of had to figure out, okay, from the get-go, I have to start with that. I have to return promises from the very beginning, so that that'll end up working.
So basically, you have to start with asynchronous, and then inside those promises, you can do synchronous things. But a lot of times, it's just better to say, if you have one piece of code talking to another piece of code, you can just use promises and not have to worry about it. Okay. I know there's a lot, and promises can be a while to wrap your brain around. But are there any questions at all?
If that promise got resolved, and it have the same effect as a set time up zero or later.
Yep. It's still, I'll still treat it. And actually, maybe we should have Justin look away, because I'm pretty sure I do something you're not supposed to do. Oh no, I still do it the right way. Okay, good. So this is what. So I have this in my stores. There's probably a better way to do this, but locally I keep track of all the data for the store, and then I go and check. Say, hey, do I already have that data? If I do, I'm just going to return a resolved promise, and then that way it can have. That way I don't have to worry about calling. And then I don't have to worry about calling other pieces of code. It's basically cached. I can go and say, hey, just return it anyway immediately. But the code, the interface to the code is still the same. So, okay. Any other questions? Did you have a choice, or was it kind of more like a conquistador? No.
I was forced. So I wrote a personal website, and it's just to try it out. I know these things can be moving that way. It seemed that, and because I'm new, I just kind of want some feedback. It seems almost like asynchronous is more work and more annoying and more difficult until you realize you can do things at the same time.
Yeah.
Is there some other benefit to that, or is that pretty much that benefit?
That's pretty much the benefit. And on the browser side, you have to deal with asynchronous stuff anyways, like, kind of managing that.
Sure.
Then on the server side, yeah, I mean, it's nice that, on my side, I can make tons of API requests and whatever, and it all manages it.
Yeah, just add that there are actually two other things that are nice about it. One, if you decide at some point you want to scale out, you want to add more servers in your infrastructure, offload work, whatever, offload jobs, you can, because everything's asynchronous, you can send that job out and come back or whatever. The other thing is things like DDMs and throttle, you can't do that in PHP because nothing happens asynchronously. So they do things like batching and being able to add performance improvements and whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Because honestly, I mean, it literally is, it feels a little bit like a pain until it's like, oh, I'm going to make these 20 API recalls, do them in parallel.
Right. And in the beginning, it was. Why am I even doing this? Until I realized, oh, here's a point I actually need to run about 14 at once. And it was more than 3 times faster.
Yeah. And I think as a company, as we move to more services and APIs, we'll probably still have plenty of APIs that run PHP, where it's kind of more simple. It's just kind of what we need to do, whatever. But there might be times where we find, like with our, I wrote our push notification API using Node, and it was nice because in PHP I have to go and write workers and maintain a pool of them. Then also have the web interface, and then use like Redis to kind of manage like all the state between everything. Node wrote it in Node. It serves the website. It handles the API. It handles the kind of its internal, workers per se, where it can go and schedule things. It's kind of isolated, contained thing of job, so it's just really nice for these kind of smaller things, and so. And whether we decide to use more JavaScript on the server side, we can make those judgment calls. When it comes to the browser side, we don't have the option to write PHP on the browser side. But when you're dealing with AJAX requests, you're going to have to deal with asynchronous issues anyway. And so it's kind of you kind of can get to learn how to do that and manage them in an okay way instead of having like this this guy right here with callbacks would have been awful. It would probably be just as wide as it was long. And so so that's just a good way. And then once again, I've been able to kind of refactor and shovel things around and move the promises around, and it also works. Whereas with callbacks, it would have been really, really hard. Okay. Any other questions even on the JavaScript side? Okay.
So for us that scripts outside of React and whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that I use promises with jQuery.
Yep.
And do jQueries and promises to keep on getting that?
Yeah, I think so. Most libraries are pretty, as long as they're A+ compatible, they're pretty compatible with each other. They might not have some of the helper things, and some of the debugging call stack stuff might be different. But for the most part, promises are pretty compatible with each other. So you can start getting most of the benefits from if you have the jQuery promise there, you can go ahead and use that.
I think there are some caveats to the jQuery because it's not A+, but you can wrap that. You could take like another promise library and wrap the jQuery promises, right?
Yeah.
So jQuery promises are different than Bluebird or some of these A+ ones. So I think they have libraries to make it so you can use jQuery with these A+ ones. You just have to call it a little bit different.
Most promise libraries have like some sort of function that will take another promise library.
Yeah.
Yeah, or something like that.
Okay.
And do you find, so I know the browsers have started putting promise stuff like that. Do the third-party library basically just fall back to using the browser? Promise?
I'd have to look at the documentation for the ones, but I think I don't know if Bluebird I don't know. I'd have to look at the documentation. I think it'll be based on the per library. But if you look at Bluebird and said, oh, if it's text that it's already there, then not. I assume most of them don't because sometimes they have helper functions that aren't part of the A+ spec, and so. But they're all really fast and yeah. But that'd be on per promise library. You have to look at the documentation for that. But I'm sure if it did that, it would advertise it like, yeah, it's more. Or if it's not there, it'll fill it in. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's a polyfill for the promises. There's like someone who has a library says, hey, I'll go and detect if it's there, and if it's not there, I'll go add it. So, any other questions? All right, thank you, everyone. Now I can eat.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. You're already late.
6 minutes late, Justin. Stop hanging out.
So Justin, where you were showing that this thing before, there's actually a library called MinConf. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Mm-mm.
It's pretty awesome. So what it does is it wraps things. I think it uses Optimus or something like that.
Mhm.
But it uses a number of different things and brings it all together. So I love to use it because it's so simple to set up, and it can do it can process files, it can process command line arguments and environment variables, and treat them all the same and use your endconf.get whatever, and it doesn't care where it came from, whether it was passing a file, the command line, or an environment variable.
What we need is you need to have you need to make a public repo and call it modules you love, like node modules you love, or JavaScript modules you love, and just have a list and be like, hey, these things do these, because that's one of the problems I run into is like when you go to look for stuff, there's so many, and NPM searching functionality is not as very good.
And yeah, it'd be good to talk about rationale, why you chose one library over another.
But
make that, the config.js.
Yeah.
But it's also way easy to share your NPM. That's another thing I love about JavaScript because naturally kind of encapsulate stuff, that's really easy to go in and say, I'm going to grab this little piece and I'm going to make its own package and ship it up. And the imp handling, I wish Composer had something like that because it makes it really easy to do. Treat it like a module, but then do your own dev work.
Just get rid of it. I don't know why it is. That's crazy.
Synchronous. That's totally it. That's totally why it's true.
I was doing about that. And then I did.
Yeah, well, summer,
Which was a little weird, but
the next couple of days.
that's
We're
it's good. But I'm just going to do it forms. It takes them all. Yeah, I'm like, yeah, are you using it with the formula? It looks like or nothing like it. And it looks like it would increase the time it slowed down each time it ran. So I cloned it and then I run it again. It was literally like double each time. Then I hung up my browser.
So promises are pretty much considered basics.
Yeah.
If you don't know Java,
They'll be part of
you
the
don't know promises, then you don't even know basics.
Well, it depends on what you mean by basics. Like, even though the basics of PHP, have the right object code. I think essentials is probably the word you're looking for rather than basics. Because the basics would be, like someone on the content team could do. The essentials, I think, would be.
Yeah, I think essential. So it's just we should call it essential. Essentials cover more than basics. Yeah. That would be just basics. I want essentials.
There is not spray underneath that one.
Thank you.
want chicken. I thought you were like so many sweets today. I'm going for a cookie because I'm hungry. So, and water because it's here. May take like one for my desk.
Too lazy, bro.
You don't want to.
Don't be that person. Don't.
That person. Someone is going to be grateful because they're like, oh, I didn't want one either.
Chocolate chip.